Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. This is our second or third webinar from the New England Centenarian study and several of our studies that fall under that name, the Integrative Longevity Omics study, the Longevity Consortium Centenarian Project, and our study RADCO, all of which I'll mention in the talk in our webinar. I'm Dr. Tom Pearls. I am a professor of medicine at Boston University, the director of the New England Centenarian study, and I'll be your maitre d', so to speak, of the webinar today, where I will give a presentation. At the beginning, I'll introduce a panel of my colleagues who help run the study and are integral parts of the study, who will also help in answering your questions, which we're going to leave plenty of time for at the when I'm done with my talk, which is really only about 9 or 10 slides. I'd love to thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you'll find this a really interesting meeting for all of you. And I think we'll go ahead and proceed. Oh, one more thing before we go to this next slide. I will say that many of you are joining us because of the newsletter that we sent out. We hadn't sent out a newsletter for a bit of time, in part because of COVID, unfortunately, when we really had to lay pretty low for the protection of our participants. We stopped seeing them in person. And I will also say, because of COVID, we lost a number of our research assistants who went on to do other things that they could do remotely, or they thought as an opportunity to change their lives a bit with a new career. So as a result, I would say that a number of you fell through the cracks, and we've heard, and so that was really the reason we sent the newsletter out. One of the main reasons was to connect back with our participants. We've been in touch with many before them, but we saw the newsletter as an opportunity to also grab the folks who we might have missed. And many of you very kindly have contacted us through phone and mail. And I will also say that since COVID, we are now really back to full strength at our sites at Boston University, Einstein College of Medicine, working on being at full strength at Georgia State University. And I'll mention a little bit about what we're doing there that's so exciting. And so we're just really, really thankful that you all are here with us today. And now I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So the New England Centenarian study, as many of you know, started way back when my hair was black, and that was back around 1995. Since then, you know, that's a long time. We've recruited and enrolled a bit more than 3,000 centenarians and their offspring's spouses. And now we're actually even starting to think about expanding that to grandchildren. We're certainly doing that in a sister study called the Long Life Family Study, because we realized that longevity for at least some group, some segment of our participants runs very strongly in families. So these are just some photos. There's a picture of one of our research assistants visiting a participant in their home. We're still wearing masks because COVID is still around. We don't want to be exposing anyone unnecessarily. So we're still really quite careful. And we do most of the visiting by video through a Zoom call. We send folks a computer tablet, and we do our neuropsych testing, neuropsychological assessment, cognitive function testing by video, and a number of other things like grip strength, for example. We do by video as well. And then all of you know, I'm sure, that we send a bunch of questionnaires. And again, I'm very, very thankful for your filling those out for us. One of the reasons there's a photo here of the research assistant with one of our participants is that when a participant is local, that is in the Boston area or the New York area or the Atlanta, Georgia area, our assistants will travel to see you to set up the equipment for the video visit, and also they'll draw a sample of your blood and give you a kit for your collection of a stool sample. And I'll talk a bit more about what we do with all those resources later in the talk. In the middle is a photo taken a little while ago of me visiting with a centenarian and her daughter. And they had come in because one of the local news stations was very anxious to learn more about the study and meet with these two wonderful people. And then the photo of the person on the far right is one of our older gentlemen who's very proud of the certificate he's holding in his hands of being a member of Patton's Army. And during the Battle of the Bulge, actually, I think he was 106 in this photo, and standing next to him is his daughter and son-in-law. And this young gentleman was actually living on his own. All right, next slide, please. I want to introduce to you some folks who are going to be part of our Q&A, our question and answer panel. And Sophia Millman is an associate professor of medicine and director of the Human Longevity Studies at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She directs our data collection and biosample collection site at Einstein College of Medicine. And so we have a hub in New York City. To the right is Stacy Anderson, assistant professor and co-director of our New England Centenarian study. Dr. Anderson's specialty is in behavioral neuroscience. She runs everything that has to do with our cognitive function studies. And she does that also with another colleague at Columbia University for our long life family study. On the bottom left is George Murphy. Dr. Murphy is an associate professor of medicine and co-director of our fabulous Center for Regenerative Medicine at Boston University and Boston Medical Center. George is in charge of these very interesting cells called induced pluripotent stem cell lines, which I will be briefly talking about. And then you certainly can ask Dr. Murphy questions when we're at the end of my presentation. Last but certainly not least is Brad Petrowitz, who is our research coordinator for the three studies I had mentioned earlier that fall under the New England Centenarian study, not the Long Life Family study, but all the others. He is a grandmaster at juggling many things at the same time, and we have Brad on our panel just in case any of you might have some specific questions about our day-to-day operations and how we might help. You have a specific question. If we don't get to any questions at the end of any of your questions at the end of the talk, then we certainly will do our best to answer them by email. In the meantime, as I give my presentation, if you have any questions, please email them to agewell@bu.edu. And if you don't have access to email, well, please write down your question give that to a loved one who does have access to email. Get those questions to us, and we'll be sure to answer them for you. We love hearing from our participants, and every now and then I get a chance to pick up the phone, and people are a little surprised to hear from me, but I'm very happy to speak with you. If you don't hear me on the other end and want to talk with me, please just ask for me. All right, we'll go on to the next slide. Well, what's special about centenarians? Everybody on this call already knows for many, many reasons other than the ones that I'm about to say. But from our scientific point of view, centenarians are rare, as you all know. We even have some folks who live to 105, who we call them semi-supercentenarians, and 110 and older supercentenarians. Centenarians, or 100-year-olds, generally they occur in the population about 1 per 5,000 in the population. At any one time in the United States, there's about 90,000 centenarians, maybe a bit less, in the entire country. But then the numbers dramatically fall, much more so over a 5-year period than, for example, at any younger age. So that by the time you're looking at people who are 105 to 109, they're about 1 per 250,000 in the population. And men are even more rare. I'll say that about 85% of centenarians are women, and just 15% are men. And so the men are even more rare. And the women, yes, they win the longevity marathon compared to men. More of them are crossing that finish line than the men, and we might get a little bit into why that may be. It's certainly a very hot topic for us because not that much is understood about that phenomenon. And then supercentenarians are people 110 and older. These folks range in age, for our study, 110 to 119. And they occur at about 1 per 5 million in the population. At any one time, I'd say there's somewhere between 60 and 70 supercentenarians countrywide. And then the next little bit for this slide. Next slide. Here's a picture of that person I was mentioning who was 119. That's Sarah Knaus, who we met actually way back in 1999. And at the time, she was the second oldest ever in the world. And this is a picture actually of her with her great, great, great grandson. And one of our few participants who was a member of 6 living generations within a family. We've had a few other 6th-generation families, but that was more the case where the women in each generation had had children at pretty young ages, late teens, early 20s. And if each generation is doing that, then you have the opportunity for 6 living generations. Sarah is no longer, holds the record. She's passed away, but she held the record for second oldest ever for a very long time, up until just the end of last year, where she got knocked down a rung to the 3rd oldest ever. The oldest ever was Jean Comment, a lady in the south of France who was age 122 in 1997. While 119 sounds close, it's only 3 years younger. It might as well be eons. There's a huge, huge difference in terms of the odds of getting to these ages. And millions and millions of people have died since 1999, when Sarah Knaus was around, 1997. And except for Sarah and one other, nobody's come remotely close to that age. So it's an extremely rare feat to achieve. Next slide, please. So it is interesting that people age very differently from one another, very much so for the vast majority of folks who are able to survive into their 70s, 80s, their late 80s, maybe a little bit into their early 90s. All you have to do is really just look at your neighbor generally to see how some people just age more quickly or more slowly than others. People do a lot of either good things or bad things to their bodies that play a really important role in the variation in how all of us age. So I would say that about 70 to 75% of the variation in how old we live to be to about age 90 is going to be related to your health-related behaviors, whether you smoke, drink too much, don't get enough sleep, your kind of diet, whether one is overweight or even obese, the kind of diet you have, if there's a lot of red meat in the diet, or if you're vegetarian. There's about 5 or 6 major behaviors, I think, that explain a lot of the variation in whether people are going to be dying in their 60s and 70s with a lot of smoking and high blood pressure and being overweight and adult onset diabetes, or if they really do relatively very, very well, doing everything right and getting to close about 90, I would say. With centenarians, what is it that allows these folks to get beyond 90 and go on to be 100 and older? One of the really interesting things is I think they generally have a lot of resilience, even if they have an age-related disease, because they are generally disability-free up through their early to mid-90s. And I would imagine that is ringing very loud and clear among those of you on this listening to this presentation. On the other hand, there can be quite a range in terms of the centenarians, even if they're disability-free, living independently up through their early 90s. Some of them will have age-related diseases even before the age of 80, who we call survivors with these diseases. Again, being quite resilient, doing quite well into their early 90s, despite the presence of usually just 1 or 2 diseases. Then we have folks who've had age-related diseases after the age of 80. We call them delayers. And then we have these few, about 15%, who are these true escapers, who not only are disability-free up through their early 90s, but they don't have really much in the way of any age-related disease that is normally associated with increased risk of death at the age of 100. And it's these folks, these 15% at 100, who represent the vast majority of the folks who have the opportunity to go on to be 106 and older. The majority of people getting to those ages necessarily have had to really escape disability up through their 90s, if not older, but also escape these age-related diseases like Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, certain cancers. So the super centenarians, no offense to the rest of our participants, are really the creme de la creme in terms of this extreme survival. Next slide. The interesting thing about these folks who do get to 110, instead of being that mishmash of folks in terms of the age of onset of age-related diseases being before the age of 80, after 80, or after 100, they're really similar in terms of when they do develop age-related diseases. As I said, usually not until they're escapers at 100. They may not develop age-related diseases till about 105 if they're going to go on to be 110. Because they're so alike in that way, we think they have some things in common that allow them to get to these very, very old ages. That is some genes, that they may have some combinations of genes. We all have the same genes, we just have different variations of those genes. And for about 200 genes, we think there are some variants that are protective, things that slow down aging-related diseases, or slow down aging and also decrease your risk for age-related diseases, greatly delaying them. Because they're so alike, in terms of trying to discover what factors underlie that remarkable survival and health benefit, we don't need the usual tens of thousands of subjects in a study to try and find what they have in common, but rather we think a sample size of maybe about 1,000 individuals. Right now, we have about 200 supercentenarians having been enrolled in the study. As I said, we have about 3,000 subjects total. We have that's the largest sample of supercentenarians collected anywhere in the world. We also have about 600 or so people over the age of 105, excuse me, and the remainder are these centenarians and their kids. We're not just studying the supercentenarians for these genetic variants and other things that I'll mention, where everybody is incredibly important as we try and understand what it takes to get to these different extreme ages. Next slide. So the New England Centenarian Study has applied for and received funding for a number of different projects from the National Institute on Aging. They're called the Longevity Consortium Centenarian Project, the Long Life Family Study, the Integrative Longevity Omics or ILO study, and the Resilience and Resistance Against Alzheimer's Disease in Centenarians and Their Offspring. All of these studies are really looking for, in slightly different ways, the various, trying to understand more about the advantages or disadvantages of getting to these most extreme ages. What are the what factors can we find that go along with living to these very old ages? And if some of those factors are specific genes or the proteins those genes produce or certain metabolites or various kind and species of bacteria and substances that we find in the gut, and then we also collect a lot of the phenotypic data, that is the clinical data. Do people have a certain kind level of cognitive function? Do they delay or escape Alzheimer's disease? What are their clinical characteristics that we want to study further? But the various things we're getting from the blood, like the proteins and the metabolites and the genetic variants and so on, those are going to tell us about the biological mechanisms, how people are biologically doing this. From that, we may be able to then understand markers that we can find in the blood that might predict who's going to go become a centenarian or even a semi-supercentenarian or a supercentenarian. But very importantly, who's going to go on to not ever develop Alzheimer's disease? And what are the mechanisms that are allowing that to happen? It's a really interesting, different way of trying to understand the questions I've brought up. In the past, it was a matter of studying Alzheimer's disease or studying certain cancers and trying to understand what factors people had that predisposed them to those things. We've turned that on its head. We're not trying to find the factors that predispose people to diseases. We're trying to find the factors that allow resistance or resilience against those diseases. If we can find out how they do this, we might be able to develop screening strategies, even drugs or therapeutics that we might be able to give people that would allow them to be like a centenarian, even though they may not have been born with what it takes to get there otherwise. Next slide. I'm almost done with my presentation, and then we'll be going on to answer your questions. So I mentioned some of the things, some of the data we collect. I mentioned Dr. Anderson. She runs and has designed the various studies that we perform to get a very careful and detailed idea of a person's cognitive function. Not just their short-term memory, but their long-term memory, their ability to name things, to understand various things that are told to them, their ability to recognize things, to have these visual spatial skills. There are many, many different cognitive functions besides just memory that we very carefully measure. We give you all watches to what look like watches that we put on your wrist that measure your physical function and your and how you sleep over a week's period of time. We collect a lot of, and I know all of you feel it is a lot of data, but we collect a lot of family pedigree data as well to get an idea of the ages that people are living to in your family. If possible, to find out a bit more about things like where they were born, where they passed away, just to really get an idea of what kind of longevity might be running in your family. We really appreciate the time and effort that you spend on filling out these questionnaires, because we really use every little bit that you can give us. We collect your medical and dental history, and we also send out a form to get an idea of your diet and all the different things that you eat on a regular basis. From that, we can figure out your vitamin intake, whether you're vegetarian or if it's just a very mixed kind of diet. And then if you're in our RADCO study, and the way that works is everybody's enrolled into either the Integrative Longevity Omics study or the Centenarian project of the Longevity Consortium. And we do pretty much similar studies, whether you're in one or the other of those. But from that, we can determine one's eligibility to be in our resistance or resilience to Alzheimer's disease study, RADCO. And the folks who go into RADCO also get an MRI if they live within a few hours of Los Angeles, Boston, New York City, or Atlanta. And then we also, everybody gets an opportunity to provide a blood sample. Either our research assistant, if you're local to one of our sites, will come out and draw some blood. I know it's a lot of tubes, but really it's only 3 tablespoons of blood, which is not much. From that relatively small sample of blood, we generate an enormous amount of data, including up to about 7,000 to 10,000 different kinds of proteins, about 6,000 or 7,000 different types of metabolites. We obtain information about your genes, the genetic makeup, and we also get information about what's called gene expression studies, or understanding which genes are turned off and turned on. And even most recently, you might have heard about these biological clocks, where we get information that tells you about your biological age versus your real age. We also send you a kit to obtain a fecal sample. And for some that sounds disgusting, but I can't tell you how valuable getting the sample from you is. And it's really not that bad. Just to get into the very picturesque nitty gritty of it, everybody has to wipe their rear end with some toilet paper, and there'll be a little bit of stool on the toilet paper. We give you a little plastic tool just to scoop a little bit of stool from there, and you just stick it in the test tube and you're done. So please be a scientist for us. Do that little step for us. Then the test tube goes in an envelope, and it goes in it's sent back by FedEx. And from that, we get to learn all about what's called your gut microbiome, where there are thousands and thousands of different species and quantities of bacteria in your gut, some of which produce very healthy substances that cross from inside your intestine into your bloodstream and circulate in your blood. And there's some belief that these substances also can cross into what's called through the blood-brain barrier into your brain. And there's been associations with a healthy microbiome and resilience to Alzheimer's disease, for example. And on the other hand, there may be some bacteria that are not so good for you. They produce substances that we want to understand as well. This study is probably, from a cutting edge point of view, the most cutting edge in terms of us obtaining blood samples from some participants that we sent to Dr. Murphy, who is able to isolate from those special tubes that we send for the collection of those cells. He's able to transform those in the lab into what's called pluripotent stem cells. And George is probably one of just a few labs in the world that is the best at this. And to now do this just from blood, rather than having to get some very special cells through very invasive means like a bone marrow biopsy or a skin biopsy. Now we just can do it. You can just do it with a blood sample. Once he has these kinds of cells, you can do other things with the cells, again, in the dish, to turn them into tissues like certain brain cells, liver cells, and so on and so forth. Once he has the brain cell of a centenarian without having to get a biopsy from their brain, just from using a blood sample, he can do all kinds of experiments with those cells in a dish to understand why they age more slowly than other people, what makes them resilient or resistant to something like Alzheimer's disease. George is able to do things in a dish that has never been able to be done before, that will take years and years off of and greatly speed up our ability to make the kind of discoveries we're aiming to make. And then finally, for participants in RADCO who are willing, we ask for the tremendous gift of a brain donation, and a very large amount of money and effort is dedicated to this brain that gets sent quickly under ice to a laboratory at UCLA that specializes in understanding the pathology and the health of a brain from a centenarian, understanding is there any evidence of Alzheimer's disease, cerebrovascular disease, other rare forms of neuropathology versus just being an incredibly healthy brain. We have folks who may have evidence of disease, but before they passed away, they were in remarkable shape. So we need to understand how did they become resilient against these markers of disease in the brain. We also use portions of the brain and send those to a lab at Beth Israel Deaconess, our collaborators at Harvard, who will do gene expression studies of these very specific areas of the brain to understand what genes are turned off and turned on. That might be important for resilience and also what we call cognitive super aging, or the ability to have the cognitive function of somebody who's 30 years younger. And I think with that, the next slide. Let's skip this slide because I've been over everything in that slide. We're ready for our questions and comments. And I think what we'll do is now, if we could have our panel show up on the screen, just so you could get to meet everybody. There's George and Brad and Stacy and Sophia. I'm Dr. Tom Pearls, and I'm going to go through now our questions. Just give me a moment so I can take a look. All right, so I'll take on the first question, which is, do you or did you have vegetarians in the study? Many? Any conclusions as of yet? We have had vegetarians. We've had people trying all kinds of interesting diets as well. I think some folks have taken to heart some of these, some diets that have really been widely talked about in the press, particularly the Mediterranean diet or the Okinawan diet. But I would say among our centenarians, we haven't really seen any particular pattern. And in fact, I've heard particularly from the Ashkenazi Jewish centenarian study, and I'll let Sophia talk about that in a minute, about some interesting diets despite still being able to live to very old age. But we really otherwise have not seen much of a pattern. And I would say there's other studies indicating that a vegetarian diet is conducive to healthy aging. I would say it's primarily because it lacks red meat, which I think has some particularly significant problems associated with a propensity for cardiovascular disease, developing plaque in the blood vessels, and so on. So one reason why a vegetarian diet might be good for you is that it doesn't contain red meat, but there's other benefits as well. Being vegetarian is one of the things that Seventh-day Adventists like to do. And in a study of Seventh-day Adventists, being vegetarian added about 2 additional years to that group's their life expectancy. The rest of their behaviors, if they did everything like not smoking, being vegetarian, regular exercise, not being overweight, those were the main characteristics. All of those together amounted to about an extra 10 years for women and an extra 7 years for men. Doesn't get you to 100, but for the vast majority of the population, it probably does get you well into your 80s in good health. So, Sophia, maybe you want to talk about some of these interesting characters from the Ashkenazi Centenarian study and their diet.
Sure, thanks, Dr. Pearls. So as Dr. Pearls mentioned, I would agree with his assessment, right? A healthy diet is important and it will protect you, probably allow you to get into your 80s, maybe into your 90s in good health. But we haven't seen any evidence that will actually get you into your hundreds. And we have done a study specifically comparing the dietary habits of people who are 95 and older to those who lived during the same time period but didn't live as long. And remarkably, what we found was that they had consumed very similar diets. Those who lived to 95 were no more likely to be vegetarians. They were no more likely to eat a low-fat diet or a low-calorie diet. They were just as equally likely to drink small amounts of alcohol. So we really didn't find that any particular diet or lifestyle, for that matter, contributed to this exceptional longevity. But again, for most of us who don't carry these longevity genes, we should probably follow a healthy diet, right? Because that will get us at least into our 80s and 90s in good health.
Okay, this next question I think should be for Dr. Anderson. The question is, any comments on cognitive function and sleep dysfunction?
Yes, so I would say one of the most reversible causes of cognitive dysfunction is making sure that you get good sleep. If you're not sleeping around 8 hours, or you're having disrupted sleep due to sleep apnea, those are things that you can go to a sleep specialist for and problem solve there. And so I always say, if you feel like your cognition is not the same that it used to be, you should really discuss it with your physician, but then also talk about some of the contributors to cognition that you might not readily think of as important.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just add that as a geriatrician on our geriatric service at Boston Medical Center, it is very, very difficult for our older patients to sleep in the hospital. And it is one of the reasons why we try to keep people at home, if at all possible, because the hospital can be such a disorienting place, and it gets people constipated and they can't sleep. It just becomes a miserable situation. But I would say one of the really most potent causes of acute confusion that we have in the hospital is when people aren't getting enough sleep. Sleep is a period of time in which our brain is doing some really interesting things that I think just at a almost cartoonish level, there are these cells in our brain that are these garbage collectors, and they collect all the garbage that our cells are producing as a result of metabolism and so on. And it's during sleep that these cells are working hard to get rid of the garbage. And this has really only recently been observed and determined. So you can imagine, if you're not getting enough sleep and you're allowing the collection of all this toxic stuff in your brain, it's no wonder that people get very confused. So I think it really is important that if you're not getting enough sleep, talk to your doctor about it. Get involved in something called sleep hygiene. Certainly, Dr. Anderson had mentioned ruling out things like obstructive sleep apnea. There are ways that can be treated, and it's really quite common. So sleep is a very, very important piece of the puzzle in healthy aging. So this is a hard question for Dr. Anderson again. And we are, in our studies, very early in the game here, because Radko just recently started. But the question for you, Dr. Anderson, is what have you learned so far about resistance to Alzheimer's disease?
So what I'll say we know so far is that this is something that studying centenarians really gives us the power to look at resistance to Alzheimer's disease. We're kind of, in some ways, following in the footsteps of another centenarian study, at least on the brain health front, and that's called the 100+ study. It's in Amsterdam, and they study centenarians in the Netherlands, but they only study cognitively healthy centenarians. And they've found that about half of their sample have no evidence of Alzheimer's disease in their brain. And that's probably one of the major reasons that they are able to remain cognitively healthy until the very end of life. And they fit this resistance profile. But then what's interesting is the other half of their cognitively healthy centenarians do have evidence of pretty high amounts of Alzheimer's disease proteins in their brain, yet they remain cognitively healthy. And so we say that they fit a resilient profile, and those two words are pretty similar. But on the first, in the first example, the resistance is completely avoiding Alzheimer's disease. And then the other one is having a remarkable ability to cope better with it. You have the proteins in your brain, but you still function normally. And so, as Dr. Pearl stated, we're just starting to head down this road. We are identifying who is resistant and who is resilient to Alzheimer's disease, so we can understand how each of them have underlying biology that's different or compensation that's different that allow them to maintain good cognitive function through their whole life, with the idea that we want everyone to live their whole life cognitively healthy, regardless of whether you're living to 80 or 100.
So, Dr. Anderson, I'm going to ask you another question that's related to this. One of our participants asks, what is your definition of cognitive healthy?
So I would say the most common way that we define it is if you are able to go about your typical daily activities as you always have. So are you able to get around, either transporting yourself or arranging for transportation? Are you still maintaining your finances on your own and without difficulty? Are you able to engage in all the activities that you want to do every day? And maybe that's not running a marathon, but maybe it is. But that's generally the line of how we define cognitively healthy. A lot of people are worried about, misplacing their keys. And I would say that's more attention deficits. We have a lot of things going on in our lives that are competing for our attention. Those are not the kind of cognitive complaints I would necessarily worry about unless they're really interfering all day long with your activities. It's really more things like going to a place that you go to every day and getting lost on the way home, or not knowing people that you see every day.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask this question of Dr. Murphy because I'm personally curious to hear what he has to say. But the question is, as each of you assess various aspects of aging to 100, does it make you more or less likely to want to live to 100 yourself?
What an insightful question. And I would say it's an absolute privilege for me to be a part of the study with this esteemed group, but also to get access and try to understand this remarkable group of people, centenarians. And so I think one of the things that I've learned, and I'm a stem cell biologist, this is what a stem cell biologist looks like, by the way, is that it's a fascinating subject. And I think our goal in trying to understand resistance to disease, or this resiliency that we're talking about in the lab, isn't so much to extend lifespan so that you could live to 100, but it's something that I've learned from this group, from Dr. Pearls, which is health span rather than lifespan. So can you extend the time of your life in which you are cognitively and physically healthy? So I think I've actually made adaptations in my own diet. So I become vegetarian, for example, and have been sort of more interested in sort of maybe interventions that I could apply to my own life as far as supplementation, things of that nature, to try to increase my health span. So the time that I will live will I'll be sort of the most vital, the most healthy, the most active for as long as possible. I think that's what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid that inevitable decline and trying to sort of stave that off for as long as possible. And that's the insights that we're trying to actually put together in the lab as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, George. I'm not going to ask everybody else this because I think George just gave the perfect answer that we'd all like to emulate. But here's a question I think for Dr. Millman. It has to do with the role of geography, since you were talking about differences about diet. Have you studied the role, if any, that geography plays? Is there a map in the United States that shows a density of centenarians per state or region?
Right, so thank you for that question. Wouldn't we all move to that magical place, right? So you're absolutely right in noting that there are certain regions that seem to be enriched in centenarians. There are certain countries around the world that have higher proportions of centenarians per number of people in their population, right? Japan is one of them. There's a place in South America. There are these hubs, right, of centenarians. Some call them the blue zones. When you look across the United States, the centenarian populations are also not distributed evenly. There are some states that boast larger proportions of centenarians. These include California, New York State, Florida. However, when you look at the total numbers of centenarians versus percentages of centenarians per numbers of population, what you find is that the states with the largest number of centenarians are also the most heavily populated states, right? So it's probably not that these states have a higher percentage of population of centenarians, just that they have the largest number because there are more people in that state. And so if you look right at your statistics, the chances of someone being a centenarian in a populous state is greater because you just have more people.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. I think tied to this question, I'm going to take the next two that is a bit related to this. One is one of the participants had mentioned that he had actually the opportunity, and he and his dad, both of them in the study, I think, got a chance to meet Dan Buettner, who wrote the Blue Zones book. We've had Dan here sitting with us a long time ago. I turned him on to the idea of maybe looking into the Seventh-day Adventists and why they're able generally to have these long life expectancies by virtue of their religion promoting certain very healthy related behaviors. And I think Dan's mention of at first he really wanted what would have been a very popular book about being able to talk about regions of the world that just were brimming with centenarians. And we were we told Dan that just didn't exist. There are some places that that say they have lots of centenarians, like the island of Dominica. The country of Azerbaijan at one point, when it was part of the Soviet Union, actually had postage stamps of people living to 130, 140. But these, there's all kinds of reasons why one might see these pockets, so to speak, but most of them have to do with nationalism, some kind of bringing tourism, longevity tourism to a place, and so on. They really don't exist. Now, there are areas that have a really unusually high number of 90-year-olds, which is pretty interesting. And whether that be a particular region in Tibet, certainly Okinawa is known for having a lot of nonagenarians. Even Hong Kong has more than you would expect. We think one reason for that is that the government does everything it can to not let people smoke. And so it's a pack of cigarettes is super expensive there. You can't smoke in public. There's all kinds of things they do to discourage smoking, and that has amounted to the highest average life expectancy in the world. So that's to answer one of your questions. The other is about race and ethnicity. And unfortunately, in our studies for the past 15 or 20 years, we mostly have just whites in the study. And the reason for that has just been the way, it's been an artifact really of the way in which we recruit and enroll participants with voter registration lists and people who are willing to answer their mail and so on. And whereas other races and ethnicities need different methods of recruitment with a lot of community engagement and advertising and marketing in particular media and so on. And that's one of the reasons actually that Georgia State University has joined us as one of the sites for our studies, where they are concentrating on recruiting and enrolling African Americans into the study. And we also work with UCLA, where there are specialists there who engage with the Latino community. And as we go on with our studies, get renewals of our studies, we're putting more and more resources into this, into recruiting and enrolling other ethnicities and races. I think next on the line will be Mandarin and Cantonese Chinese, because of a potential collaborator we have at New York University. The reason why this is so important is that different cultures can have quite different diets, ways of dealing with stress, and so on, different behaviors that can be quite conducive to longevity that we want to much better understand. And that those behaviors may be really important for longevity for that particular group, whereas not so important in another group. And then another really important piece to this is that genetic variants according to race or ethnicity can have different effects. So for example, there's this gene called apolipoprotein E. It has to do with a kind of cholesterol or fat that circulates in your blood. And one variant of the gene called apolipoprotein E3 or E2 is not associated necessarily with Alzheimer's disease, but the E4 variant is. And so if you inherit the E4 variant from your mom and your dad, you're at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But that's if you're white. If you're Hispanic or you're Black, there's no increased risk. And it's just fascinating. And it's really, really important for us to understand what genetic variants people have that seem to be enabling them to get to these extreme ages, but how are they different? How are those genetic signatures? Because it's not one or two genes, it's many genes, many that are protective, and getting the right combination is what makes these individuals rare. Well, there are going to be different combinations for different races and ethnicities. And for us to understand this puzzle, understand their interactions with the environment, you know, what diets, what other environments, what ways of dealing with stress, and so on. All those interactions are part of our trying to come up with an understanding of what allows these individuals to get to these extreme ages.
I did want to.
Oh yeah, please chime in.
Circle back on the blue zones comment. One interesting study. It was a very small study that we did because I saw another study found that levels of purpose in life was associated with a lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And that really struck me as interesting, especially with the population that we are studying. And one of the blue zones is in Okinawa. And so Dan Buettner puts forth the notion that it's one of the things that gets many of them to live to older than expected ages is this sense of ikigai, that they wake up with a purpose to their life, that they have things they want to do every day, and their culture there supports older adults having a very important role in the family and in the community. And so it's actually several years ago now, probably about 10 years ago now, we sent out a survey to our centenarian offspring to do a purpose in life questionnaire, and we compared them to their spouses and to another nationally representative group, and we found that the offspring do have higher levels of purpose in life. So, you know, it's just one piece of the puzzle for cognitive health, but I am interested in other psychosocial factors that might help people live healthy and have greater well-being. So occasionally we do take some of these mainstream ideas and incorporate them. So we're not just looking at biological characteristics.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Millman, here's a question from a very lucky person who says that both my parents were centenarians. How common is this? And are there any indications of how this might impact their kids?
Yes, very lucky indeed. Well, given that, right, centenarians occur at a rate in 1 in 5,000 in our population, having two parents, right, who live to age 100, right? That's 5,000 times 5,000, right? 1 out of 25, right? 250,000, I think, if my math is correct. So quite rare. Whether that contributes, right, having two parents, whether that contributes to a greater chance of achieving longevity, I would suspect probably, but we don't have enough numbers that I know of to study given the rarity. Dr. Pearls, I'd love to hear your input.
I mean, we think that genes play an important role. We also think that behaviors that you learn from your parents are probably playing a pretty important role too. To say that you're getting a double dose of all of that, one would be tempted. I think the other thing is we just don't know. We would love to have enough pedigrees to start looking at patterns. You know, does it even matter that you have two parents who got to be 100? Maybe what matters is that you had a grandparent. Does it matter that it was your father or your mother? Does it matter if it was whether the grandparent was male or female? So we just don't know, and that's one of the reasons that we ask you to please fill out those pedigrees, because that pedigree information, the family tree information, because that's just the kind of data that we need to try and sort this out in combination, for example, with the genetic data that we generate from your DNA. I think it's also not one size fits all. We do have families, whether it be in the long life family study or some of the families that we've come across elsewhere, with incredible clustering for longevity, where there could be a SIB-ship of 5 or 6 individuals getting to 100. And maybe they also had a grandparent who got to 100 as well. We've seen all kinds of interesting combinations. And there's not going to be one formula that fits everybody. Along the same lines, we talked about behaviors and diet and so on that are conducive to health span and healthy aging. And there could be some people who would not have gotten to 100 had it not been for those health behaviors. They had just enough of the genetics to get them there, but they, or maybe they barely didn't, but it was the special diet and everything else that put them over the edge. On the other hand, there's going to be some folks who just have an incredible set of protective variants who just do terrible things to themselves, and they still get to these extreme ages. Okay.
Speaking of a double dose of luck, there was a question earlier about we have a participant that happens to be an identical twin of a centenarian. So they're two twin offspring. And they asked if we have other identical twins in our study, and I know that we have at least one other set because I've enrolled both of these sets of twins. And they asked if we have any other results about twins or if we're looking at any parameters when these kind of pop up.
Thanks for chiming in, Brad. Yeah, I get one of the reasons my office is right next to Brad is because I'm right where the action is, and I get to hear everything going on. It's very entertaining, I have to tell you.
I think we don't have enough twins to be able to study them as a separate subgroup. But that question reminded me back when I first started with the study as an intern, we had twin centenarians. They were fantastic.
Yeah, finding enough twins at these ages is kind of impossible. There are twin studies, like the Danish twin study and so on, where they've tried to look at people, identical twins reared apart versus reared together, looking at identical versus non-identical twins and trying to understand the how much of getting to these older ages is genetic. And if you had a lot of centenarian twins, you could do that, but there just aren't enough to do that. So those data are helpful in understanding what percentage of the variation and how old people get to be, say, to their 80s or 90 at most, is genetic versus behavior. All right. I don't know, have any of our panelists read this book by Peter Attia, Outlive the Science and Art of Longevity? Okay, George, do you want to, I know that I'm actually mentioned in our study is mentioned in the book, but
it is. There's a whole chapter on centenarians in the book. I think the book is fantastic. So I'm a basic scientist, and obviously for me, it's all sort of data driven. And I think he blends a very nice mix of the hard science, which is referenced in the book, along with anecdotes or practice of various things. He also has a very entertaining podcast, and many of the collaborators that we work with have been on the podcast as well. So I think it's a great book. It's also, as I said, very well-rounded.
There you go. Thanks, George.
I know there's a very good story from Tom about how he first got into studying centenarians that I think our participants would like to hear.
Okay, now you have me on the spot. I have too many stories, so which one, Brad?
I know Stacy knows it too.
That you went to the older adult living community to see 2 centenarian patients.
Okay, I can tell that one. I was a fellow, you know, when you train in geriatrics, first you do your medical school and then 3 years of residency, which I did in internal medicine, and then you go on into geriatrics. I was very, very fond of older people back into my teens, and that just stuck with me. And being a geriatrician was in my genes. I don't know if being a centenarian is in my genes, though I do have a 102-year-old great-grandmother. But that was only an afterthought. I got interested in centenarians because I had a panel of patients that I was responsible for as a geriatrics fellow at this one of these 3-tiered communities that has independent living, assisted living, and then skilled nursing care. And a number of my patients were part of independent living. And at one point, I got a note from an administrator saying that there were still a couple of people I hadn't seen yet, and they both were over 100. And I actually went by to try and find them at their homes and their apartments, and they were never there. It got pretty frustrating to the point that I had to write notes in this book log to have them there waiting for me, and they didn't care about that either. So I went looking for them. One was Celia, who was actually had a concert series at the community playing piano for everybody, and I went to one of her concerts. That was my first way of meeting her. She was just playing very, very challenging, beautiful Chopin, and she was 102. And I was brought up in medical school, even in residency, with the notion of the older you get, the sicker you get. And I had expected by 100, they'd have Alzheimer's disease. They'd have every age-related disease under the sun and be on death's doorstep. This lady playing beautiful piano was definitely not like that. I figured that was just a real oddity, didn't make much of it, even though I was kind of looking for a research project at the time as part of my fellowship. And then I went to see this other person who was a 101-year-old man who was always down in occupational therapy, not getting it. He was mending people's clothes and teaching other people how to tailor their clothes. When he wasn't doing that, he was robbing the cradle, dating his 85-year-old girlfriend. It took two, but I finally came around to the idea that there was something very strange going on here. And it's kind of the dream and of any person training who's looking for a research project, that they come across something in their day-to-day work that a light bulb goes off and they discover that that hasn't really been looked at before. And that was really the case with me. And that's how the New England Centenarian studies started back in 1993. All right, thanks, Brad, for putting me on the spot. I think this is somewhat of a question for Dr. Murphy. It has to do with how do you dissect out association from causality. And Dr. Murphy really is where causality where the rubber definitely meets the road. And without what he does in the lab, we're just that's about as solid proof as you can get. So I don't know, George, if you want to speak to that a bit.
Sure. People are asking such insightful questions. So I think in the laboratory, what we do is we take a real reductionist approach, right? So as Dr. Pearls noted, from just about a teaspoonful of blood, we can make these master stem cells in a dish. And the word we use for that is pluripotency, which means the cells can grow over and over. So once we have these lines, they can exist in perpetuity, and we can share them with researchers across the world forever. But the magical thing is that we can also make them into any cell or tissue type in the body. So when we're studying things like neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's disease, we can make neurons in a dish, which in essence are brains in a dish, which recapitulate the individual they're created from. So these centenarians. So this concept of causality versus correlation is really tough, or nature versus nurture. So in our isolationist methodology, we're really just looking at the genetics of these individuals. So what we can do is take their neurons and add some sort of equivalent to an environmental stress, basically some sort of chemical that can stress the neurons, much in the same way that this would happen in your environment and the various stressors that you have on a daily basis, to try to look at the semblance of causality that's related to what someone's genetics might belie. But those things are always complicated. Dr. Pearls also mentioned these biological aging clocks, which are becoming very, very prevalent. You'll probably be hearing about them very much like 23andMe genetic screening has happened, where we can decipher at the molecular level what's the difference between your chronological age, what it says on your birth certificate, versus your molecular or biological age. And so we see very big differences there when we look at these specialized centenarians, decades difference between their biological and chronological age. In other words, their biological or molecular age is much lower. But the causality of that, sort of what's impacted that outside of their genetics, is always the tough thing to sort of decipher. So for us, we're trying to understand what are the basic genetic tenets of this in a dish. How do they have this amazing resilience? And then we can actually go from there. But these other, causal or correlative things that have to do with this combination of nature, nurture, the mix of environment, how people live, these are tougher elements. So we're trying to actually simplify it as much as possible to understand the most we can.
Okay, this next one, I think is a bit related to the family questions, Dr. Millman, but I think maybe there's something else to mention. And I think it does speak still to what a puzzle we have, even not just centenarians, but different races and ethnicities that we have to be to account for. But the question is, since behaviors play a big role in reaching 100 and beyond, have you considered having participants and their close family members to list the top reasons that centenarians reach 100? Then perhaps find the common factors and scientifically study the impact of those behaviors.
Yeah, good question. So yes, I think over the years, right, we always ask them, what do you think has contributed to you living to age 100? And almost everyone gives a different answer, right? Some people say family history. Some people say my good healthy habits, my diet, right? Some people attribute it to God. So over the years, we really have not been able to glean one specific reason, I would say, that people most commonly report. From what we have tried to figure out in terms of the most likely reasons for this exceptional longevity, I think as we have been talking about this afternoon, we find that behaviors are important, but they don't seem to be enough to get people to age 100, right? Healthy lifestyle, physical activity, avoidance of alcohol, avoidance of smoking are all important and healthy behaviors. But alone, they're not enough, it seems like, to get people to the age of 100 and beyond, right? And so what leaves us are genetics, right? Our biology. And the reason we think that is we see that longevity tends to run in families. So someone who achieves a ripe old age of 100 was 7 times more likely to have a parent who had longevity, right? They're more likely to have a sibling with longevity. And so this really suggests to us that there are genetic contributions to exceptional longevity. People might say, well, what about the environment, right? Families share environment as well. And we would agree with you. Families breathe the same air, eat the same food. But when we actually compare environments between people who live a long life and people who live an average life, we do not find differences. And so we think a lot of it is really in one's genes, and we're trying to figure out what those genes are. Now, what people will say to us, well, what if I didn't win the genetic lottery, right? Then what? Oh, so I don't have the gene. Is that the end of that story for me? And we're here to tell you no. Because once we understand what those genes are, then we can understand the biology behind their genes. And the ultimate goal is to create medicines that will mimic the action of these healthy longevity genes, so that everyone else who did not win the genetic lottery can still benefit from the knowledge that we will learn from all of the centenarians who have so selflessly contributed of themselves to this research. So really, through this research, we have the potential to improve the lives of everyone, and especially of the people who did not win the genetic lottery.
Much better said than me. All right. This question, I think, is for Dr. Anderson.
Oh.
What were you about to say something else, though?
We had a question asking why we study the offspring of centenarians, which I think is great to address.
Go ahead.
Okay. So over the years, we kind of anecdotally saw that the children of centenarians also seem to be healthier than their peers. And so we started studying them, and indeed they are following in their parents' footsteps. We've found that they are living longer than people their same age, and they're delaying cardiovascular disease and dementia. So they, in addition to their parents, are models of healthy aging. And one of the really great things that we can do by studying the children of centenarians is that we can follow them over a long period of time. So we've been following some of our centenarian offspring for over 20 years, which is really incredible. And that longitudinal data, or doing these assessments every year, gives us a lot more powerful information about what contributes to healthy aging patterns. So a great shout out to those of you who have been in our studies for that long, because you really are giving us the power to study what affects healthy aging.
Okay, thank you very much that's very, very important that everybody understand. Rather than go on to the next question that I was going to give you, Dr. Anderson, I'm going to ask Dr. Murphy this question, because I do think there's some confusion about what is the Center for Regenerative Medicine, and biological age, and so on. There's a lot of confusion, I think, about all these things. The question here was distinguishing. I just missed the question, but I think it had to do with. I think
Brad,
someone was asking. You stole it from me, but it had to do with what is the regenerative capacity, and what role might that be playing?
Yeah, so as Dr. Proles noted, we started a Center for Regenerative Medicine, which is the ability to sort of rejuvenate tissues, to sort of make them new again, to sort of heal them in the process of sort of medicine and science. And so with the centenarians, as I mentioned, the sort of modeling that we can actually do from their stem cells in a dish, we do see some really amazing things. So the ability to, as Dr. Anderson was noting, be resistant to or resilient against something like Alzheimer's disease is something that we're actively looking at now. And so what we find, and I think for me, as somebody who's a neophyte, I'm a stem cell biologist, a molecular biologist who is relatively new to these types of studies, was the fact that you do have some people with exceptional longevity that still get diseases, or they still will have various insults. But the really amazing thing is they have this ability to sort of regenerate or bounce back from these various insults in a way that far exceeds what a normal person is capable of. And that's sort of what we're seeing in the dish as well. So in neurons that we can actually make from these specialized individuals, we can apply various stressors. And one of the things that we actually see at the molecular level is that these individuals will upregulate, as Dr. Millman was saying, very special sets of genes that we think are responsible for this resilience, which allow them to actually cope with the stress much better. And so whether or not those are DNA repair mechanisms or the ability to sort of deal with these aberrant proteins that might build up in neurodegeneration, we're still studying that. But certainly the regenerative capacity of these people to bounce back, to sort of go through repair mechanisms, to modulate their immune systems. One of the studies we've shown also show that these individuals have an elite immune system that has the ability to sort of be regenerative for much longer than the average person, so that it can deal with these insults throughout a lifetime. So I think they're specialized individuals on many different levels.
Thank you, George. Dr. Anderson, we have just a little bit more time left for questions. I assure you, we will look at all the questions that have not been answered and work on sending you your answer by email. So, Dr. Anderson, here's the question. Do you think a person's mental age feeds into the equation? On my dad's 102nd birthday last week, he looked at me and for the first time in his life, he said, "I think I must be old." It hadn't occurred to him that he was middle-aged until he was about 75.
I love this question. It's something that has really fascinated me from working with centenarians, is they say they feel much younger than they are. So if you've answered our questionnaires recently, you may have noticed that we have one asking, what age do you feel like you are? And then, do you feel that your memory and thinking is better than people the same age as you, the same, or worse? Because I'm curious to see what our centenarians and our centenarian offspring feel about this.
So this is a bit of a dovetail, Dr. Anderson, and that is, there was a question about how does somebody get into RADCO? If they're already in integrative longevity omics or in the Centenarian, the consortium Centenarian project, what does it take to then be asked to be in RADCO with getting an MRI and even a brain donation? Which maybe you could also mention that, well, I'll just mention with the brain donation, I forgot to mention that we send that report and I go over the entire report with family when that is done. Centenarians then say their only regret is that they didn't get to be around to hear that darn report. But anyway, maybe you could speak a little bit about RADCO.
Yes, so we select people for our RADCO study based on their cognitive testing during the video visit that we do with you. And if you meet a certain level of performance, we reach out to you. But I will add on top of that, we are aiming to enroll people in certain areas of the United States or with certain other characteristics. So just because you haven't heard from us doesn't mean there's anything to worry about, but it is based on your performance during the video visit.
There is a question here about racial and ethnic background in the centenarians. Is it any different than the background of the country? I think this, speaking of Dr. Murphy's praise for these questions, I think this is a very insightful question because I will tell you anecdotally that whether it be while I'm on the wards as a geriatrician, taking care and looking at my oldest patients among the ones that I take care of, sometimes they are in their late 90s, early 100s. I keep thinking, gosh, a lot of these people are Black, and we've actually started to look much more systematically looking at CDC, what's called the National Center for Health Statistics. They have a lot of death data for the United States, and now they've not only have had those data for whites and Blacks, but also and for Hispanics. But they also just recently are providing those data for Asians and Alaska Native and Native Indian. I will say for right now, the data that they've produced for Alaska Native and Native Indian are not very reliable, I think because of relatively small numbers. But what is really interesting, and it's a paper that I'm working on with a resident scholar whose expertise is demography, is we're really trying to understand if there is a difference in the propensity or the risk, if you will, of the ability to getting to very old age based upon ethnicity and race. And the data so far are indicating to us that Asians seem to have a higher risk compared to others. And below that may be Hispanic. These are better than whites. And then in the 80s, a person in their 80s, their ability to go on to be in their 90s is higher for Blacks than it is for whites. Everybody starts to catch up with one another at about 100, 101, where the differences are pretty small. But there are these really important ethnicity and race differences with regard to the increased chances of getting to much older age. And it just all really, and it all really speaks again to the importance of enrolling these different groups into our study to understand if there could be a genetic underpinning for that. It kind of makes sense that there would be some differences because of the genetic differences that we've been observing, but also because the development of different races and ethnicities evolutionarily happened in different parts of the world, in different environments, under different kind of stressors. And the genes that, the genetic variations that evolved to combat those things are going to be different. And some of those may be pretty darn good for getting to very old age versus others that may be better for other aspects of survival. So it's a very, very hot and really interesting topic. And with that, it's 5:02 p.m. Maybe, Brad, you want to close this out with telling people about how they can continue to ask us questions?
Yep. So any questions that weren't answered either live or by a written response, you can email any new questions to agewell@bu.edu. And as well for any participants or any family that hasn't been contacted by us in a bit, throughout COVID or any real delay of 6 months, something like that. Please also email this, and I'll personally see to it that you're followed up by one of our current research specialists. That we've had quite a bit of turnover, so the person that you have as your contact might no longer be with the study, but we have a full team of great people now, so I will make sure that you're followed up with.
And I was just going to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. I would just say at the back of the newsletter shows all these wonderful pictures of all our research assistants at our 3 different sites at Einstein, BU, and at Georgia State. And we're just absolutely beholden to this crew that is all working very, very hard to catch up with all of you in terms of the follow-up data, collecting your data and your samples, and engaging with you. So again, please, if you feel left out, if you've fallen through the cracks, please do let us know. We apologize for that, and we will get to you right away. I think we hope that we've given back to you a little bit with this webinar. We'll keep doing this at least annually, if not more frequently. And just really appreciate that you came on with us today.
And I'll just add that we are going to post the webinar on the website. So if you want to share it with someone else, it'll be posted, I think by maybe give us a couple weeks. But also on our website is a list of our publications, and we've tried to give an easy to understand explanation of what each publication found, but there are also links to the full scientific articles if you prefer to see it that way. And if you can't find them, feel free to reach out to us. We'll help you.
And Brad, just tell everybody again our website. There it is at the bottom, bumc.bu.edu/Centenarian. So even if you can't remember that, If you just put Boston University and Centenarian into Google, it'll pop up for you. All right. I want to thank our panelists today for answering your questions. I want to thank the research assistants, many of whom are watching, for all their hard and dedicated and enthusiastic work. And everybody, please have a great evening. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you for being in the study.